In the spring of 1924, a surveyor named Marcus Hallett was contracted by the British Mandate Authority in Palestine to produce accurate measurements of a stone tower standing on an isolated ridge approximately 11 miles southeast of Jericho. The tower was roughly 40 feet tall, circular in cross-section, built from dressed limestone blocks, fitted without mortar, and had stood in its current condition for as long as any local account or written record could establish. Hallett's assignment was straightforward: dimensions, material assessment, estimated age, structural condition. He arrived at the site on a Tuesday morning carrying a theodolite, a steel measuring tape, a notebook, and a lantern he ultimately did not need because there was nowhere to take it. He spent 7 hours at the tower. He measured its exterior diameter at the base, 18 feet 2 inches. He measured the wall thickness by examining a section where a block had shifted, 4 feet 8 inches. He calculated the interior cavity diameter at roughly 8.5 feet. Then he looked for the entrance. He circled the tower 4 times at close range. He probed the base course with a steel rod. He climbed the exterior using handholds worn into the upper courses by earlier climbers and examined the top, which was open to the sky, a rough circular opening approximately 6 feet across. There was no door. There was no window. There was no opening of any kind below the rim at the top. There was no staircase. There was no ladder fixture, no socket for a ladder, no evidence that any access point had ever been sealed or removed. The interior of the tower, so far as Hallett could determine by dropping a weighted line from the top, was solid for its entire height, not hollow. Solid, he filed his report with the Mandate Authority in Jerusalem 2 weeks later. The report ran to 11 pages. It contained a section he titled Structural Anomaly that occupies the final 4 pages, and that Hallett later described in a letter to a colleague as the part they asked him not to include. The 4 pages were not in the version of the report filed in the public record. Hallett kept his original draft. He kept it until he died. The official position on towers of this type, solid, doorless, windowless, built from dressed stone without mortar, and without any internal feature that suggests habitation, storage, worship, or military function, is that they are watchtowers. The explanation has been applied to examples found in Ireland, Scotland, Sardinia, the Levant, the Caucasus, the Anatolian Plateau, and the high desert of the American Southwest, among other locations. It has been applied regardless of whether a given tower has a sufficient sightline to justify its construction, regardless of whether the terrain surrounding it offers any tactical purpose for observation, and regardless of whether the tower is solid or hollow, because a solid tower cannot be climbed from the inside, and a tower that cannot be climbed from the inside is not a watchtower in any functional sense that military history recognizes. Hallett identified this problem in the 4 pages that were removed from his report. He put it plainly: a structure built to be observed from rather than occupied cannot be explained by reference to the function of observation. What he said next, the section the Mandate Authority wanted excised, was that the towers he had surveyed were not built to be entered. They were built to be approached, and the distinction, he argued, was architectural, not philosophical. The interior of a tower built to be entered shows evidence of human presence. The interior of a tower built to be approached shows evidence of something else, or in Hallett's more precise language, of a directed relationship between the structure and its external environment that the standard classification as watchtower entirely fails to account for. Before we go further, if these buried investigations are something you want more of, hit subscribe so the next one reaches you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it you want it. To understand why doorless towers matter and why the official explanation for them has persisted despite its inadequacy, you have to understand something about the history of archaeological classification itself. When Western-trained researchers began systematically cataloging ancient structures in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they brought with them a set of functional categories derived almost entirely from the architecture of medieval and classical Europe. A tall stone structure was a tower. A tower was either defensive or observational. A structure without a door was a tower whose door had been sealed or destroyed. That classification system was applied to structures across 6 continents, in cultures that had no documented connection to European architectural tradition, without meaningful adjustment. What it could not accommodate, it simplified. What it could not simplify, it ignored. The result is a body of official literature in which dozens of structurally similar, geographically dispersed stone towers with no entrance, no internal access, no sightline justification, and no evidence of military or residential use, are all described as watchtowers. And the question of what was actually being watched from a structure no one could get inside is not asked in any document that has been published by any mainstream institution. A researcher named Dr. Elspeth Cairn, who spent 27 years as a field archaeologist with the University of Edinburgh before her retirement in 1991, published a monograph in 1988 titled Functional Anomalies in Pre-Roman Tower Architecture. The monograph was 186 pages. It was printed in a limited academic run of 400 copies. It reviewed 14 specific tower structures across 4 continents and argued, using measurements and material analysis collected over more than a decade of fieldwork, that the consistent structural features shared by these towers, the solid core, the absence of any entry point below the capstone level, the precise geometric placement relative to local topography, and the identical dimensional ratios appearing independently across cultures that had no documented contact with one another, could not be accounted for by the watchtower hypothesis. Not partially. Not with modification. The hypothesis failed the basic test of functional logic. If a tower cannot be entered, it cannot serve as a post for a human observer. Dr. Cairn made this point in her opening chapter in terms that any structural engineer would recognize as incontrovertible, and she spent the remaining 160 pages laying out what the physical evidence, taken on its own terms, actually suggested. The monograph was reviewed in one journal. The review was 2 paragraphs. It described the work as methodologically sound, but speculative in its conclusions, and recommended it to specialists only. The monograph went out of print within 18 months. Dr. Cairn's institutional affiliation at Edinburgh was listed in the publication as emeritus, which implied a standard academic retirement. She had not retired. Her research budget had been withdrawn by the department, and her field access credentials suspended after she submitted the manuscript for internal review prior to publication. The internal review process produced a letter recommending she delay publication. She did not delay. Within 6 months of the monograph's release, her university email address was deactivated, and her name was removed from the department's faculty listing without announcement or explanation. The university has never commented on this publicly. Dr. Cairn spent the remaining years of her career corresponding privately with other researchers who had encountered similar resistance. She described her situation in a letter written in 1993 to a retired colleague as the professional equivalent of having pointed at a door that everyone agreed was not there. This is where Hallett's removed 4 pages connect to a pattern that is larger than one surveyor in one territory in 1924. In 1963, a structural engineer named Pietro Vassallo was contracted by the Italian government to conduct a stability assessment of a group of nuraghi, the ancient stone towers of Sardinia, roughly 7,000 of which survive on the island, in the province of Nuoro. The nuraghi are officially classified as Bronze Age defensive structures, approximately 3,500 years old. Vassallo's stability assessment, a routine engineering document, included a section on interior void geometry, meaning he measured what was inside these towers. His measurements, which he submitted as part of the official assessment, and which remain in the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage archive in Rome, show something that has never been addressed in any official publication about Sardinian archaeology. The interior void geometry of the nuraghi he assessed is not random. It is not the product of functional necessity, of building walls thick enough to support the structure's height. The relationship between the interior cavity diameter, the wall thickness, and the tower's total height follows a ratio that is consistent across the 14 towers he measured, within a margin of less than 3%. The ratio is not a standard construction ratio. It does not appear in any other class of ancient structure Vassallo was aware of. He noted it in his assessment in a single careful sentence, described it as requiring further investigation, and recommended that an acoustician be consulted. No acoustician was consulted. The recommendation was noted. Nothing followed from it. Vassallo died in 1979. The assessment is still in the Rome archive. The ratio he documented has never been formally studied. The reason an acoustician is relevant is this: a hollow cylinder with specific dimensional relationships between its diameter, its wall thickness, and its height does not merely contain space. It interacts with energy, acoustic energy, electromagnetic energy, in ways that are precisely determined by those proportions. This is not a fringe idea. It is the foundational principle of every resonant cavity in physics, from a tuning fork to the waveguides that carry microwave signals through modern telecommunications systems. A structure built to those proportions, built with the material density and surface geometry of dressed limestone without mortar, would interact with the electromagnetic and acoustic environment around it in specific and predictable ways. Whether the builders of the nuraghi, or the tower southeast of Jericho, or the 14 structures in Dr. Cairns' monograph understood resonant cavity geometry in anything like modern terms is a question archaeology has never formally asked. But the question of whether they built structures that exhibit consistent resonant proportions is answerable from the measurements that already exist. And the answer, from the measurements that Vassallo made and filed in Rome in 1963, appears to be yes. What was being resonated, and to what end, are the questions that follow from that. They are the questions that no institution has authorized anyone to pursue. Hallett's 4 pages asked that question. Vassallo's single sentence asked that question. Dr. Cairns' 186-page monograph asked that question in 14 locations across 4 continents. In each case, the response from official institutions was the same. The question was either removed from the record, declined for serious engagement, or filed and left to accumulate dust in an archive in Rome. Connemara, Ireland, 1952, an engineer named Desmond Foyle, conducting a land survey, encounters a circular stone tower of approximately 22 feet standing alone on a coastal headland. The tower has no door, no window, no internal access. Foyle's survey notation describes it as a signal tower, consistent with the standard classification applied to similar structures along the Irish coast, a classification that was established in the early 19th century to describe towers used during the Napoleonic Wars and then applied retroactively to much older structures without revision. Foyle also notes, in a handwritten addendum that appears in his personal copy of the survey, but not in the version filed with the Ordnance Survey Office, that the tower produces a sustained audible tone when wind approaches from a specific westerly direction, a tone he describes as low, continuous, and unlike anything produced by simple wind passing over an open rim. He spends 3 additional sentences trying to characterize it. He does not develop the observation further. The addendum is 7 lines in total. It reads like a thing he wrote down because he could not quite make himself leave it unwritten, and then struck from the official record because he could not quite make himself accountable for what it implied. The Caucasus, 1971. A Soviet geological survey team working in the Georgian highlands documents 17 stone towers in a remote valley. The towers range from 15 to 60 feet in height. None has an entrance below the capstone. The survey report, filed with the Soviet Academy of Sciences, classifies them as medieval defensive fortifications. A geologist on the team named Irina Bystrova submits a supplementary note to the Academy, observing that the towers are positioned not in defensible terrain, but at what she identifies as the nodes of a triangular geometric pattern spanning approximately 14 kilometers. The note is acknowledged. It is not appended to the published survey. Bystrova's supplementary observation appears only in the draft version of the survey, which was obtained from the Academy's open archive by a researcher in 2006, 35 years after it was filed. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. The institutions responsible for the official classification of ancient tower structures have never adequately explained why the watchtower designation has been applied to solid structures, structures with no interior access, when the defining military function of a watchtower is to be occupied by a human observer. They have never explained why Pietro Vassallo's documented dimensional ratio, consistent across 14 independently constructed towers separated by geography and century, was noted in a filed official document and then left uninvestigated for the duration of Vassallo's lifetime and the 45 years that have followed his death. They have never explained why Dr. Cairns' methodologically sound monograph, described as such by the only published review it received, was followed within 6 months by the suspension of her university credentials and the removal of her name from institutional records without any public statement of cause. Why would a surveying authority ask a contractor to remove 4 pages from an official report about a building with no door if those 4 pages merely described a structural anomaly with no implications beyond the academic? Why would Soviet geologists file a note identifying a precise geometric pattern in the placement of 17 towers and have that note excluded from the published survey if the pattern had no significance beyond the mathematical curiosity of an unusual coincidence? Why would an engineer note, in a private addendum he chose not to include in his official filing, that a doorless tower produced a sustained tone in specific wind conditions, and why would he write it down at all if it seemed to him like nothing? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty what these towers were built for. What we have is a surveyor's 4 excised pages describing a structure built to be approached rather than entered. We have a consistent dimensional ratio across 14 Bronze Age towers that no one has investigated. We have a geometric placement pattern in 17 towers across 14 kilometers that was noted, filed, and buried. We have a tone in a coastal tower that an engineer wrote down in private and crossed out of his official record. These are not the residues of ignorance. They are the residues of a question that was asked and then made to disappear. Marcus Hallett retired from surveying in 1938. He kept his original 11-page report, all 11 pages, including the 4 that never appeared in any official filing, in a leather portfolio for the rest of his life. He died in 1961 in a town in Dorset. His daughter, sorting his study in the weeks after his death, found the portfolio and assumed it was professional paperwork of no particular significance. She kept it because her father had kept it, because it had clearly mattered to him, because the leather was worn at the corners in a way that suggested he had handled it many times. In 1987, 26 years after his death, she read it for the first time. She found the 4 pages. She contacted the British Library, which suggested she contact the Public Record Office, which suggested she contact an academic department, which did not respond. In 1994, she donated the portfolio to a small archive in Wiltshire that holds miscellaneous professional papers of the Mandate period. It is catalogued. It is accessible. It has been examined by one researcher in 30 years. The tower on the ridge southeast of Jericho is still standing. It still has no door. If you go there today and ask a guide what it was built for, they will tell you it was a watchtower. If you ask them who climbed it, they will change the subject. The official history of ancient towers tells us they were built to be seen from military posts, signal stations, monuments to territorial power. What the filed reports, the excised pages, the unappended notes, and the unexamined ratios tell us is that the people who actually measured these structures close up, who put their hands on the stone and ran their instruments along the walls, kept writing down the same observation in different languages across different decades on different continents. Something about these towers does not fit the explanation we have been given. Subscribe and share this with someone who still asks the questions that institutions refuse to answer. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when the last person who stood beside the tower and noticed something wrong keeps it to themselves. Next week, I am following a thread that connects Irina Bystrova's geometric placement pattern in the Georgian highlands to a survey conducted by a British cartographer in 1886, a survey that identified the same triangular node pattern in tower placements across a completely different continent. A cartographer named Arthur Peel, a map that was classified within the year of its completion. You will not want to miss it.